A rare bee species hadn't been spotted in Marin County for decades, but now a group of researchers has finally tracked one of the buzzing insects down.
Millions of frozen bees, one of the most lethal deserts on the planet, and a plan to take the first and pour it straight into the heart of the second, just to see what crawls back out alive. It sounds like something a reckless lab would do once: bury deep and never speak of again. But here's the strange part. The science sitting underneath that idea is completely real, locked in a steel tank right now, and a few researchers have quietly started asking whether it could one day drag a dead desert back to life. So, what would actually happen the moment those lids came off? Stay with me. The barren place.
It's a zone between sand and productive land, which has been severely degraded in recent years by climate change and desertification.
But before we get to that vault, sit for a moment with the place this story is really about. The first thing that hits anyone standing in the deep Sahara is the absence. It is as if the color green was scrubbed out of the world. Grays, browns, a horizon that runs on without a single living thing to break it. No trees, no grass, just heat and sand, and a silence so complete it feels like the land is holding its breath. Daytime temperatures claw past 50 degrees Celsius. Nights crash back toward freezing. There is almost nothing to eat or drink for miles in any direction. This is the hardest test any living thing can be handed, and it is exactly the kind of place people now dream of bringing back to life. Which raises the question our title is built on. What could possibly survive being released into that? The answer begins, strangely, not in the desert at all, but inside a freezer. The frozen vault.
Well, I'm getting up close with some honeybees because the Washington State University is launching a study surveying pollen, and Spokane County is playing one small but important role on honeybee health.
Start with what is actually true, because it is wild enough on its own. At Washington State University, a research team spent years building what was, for a long time, the only facility of its kind anywhere on the planet, a genetic bank for honeybees. The work is slow and physical. Male bees, called drones, are gathered by the hundreds. Their semen is collected one microliter at a time, a single drone giving up barely a drop, mixed with protective compounds, and then lowered into liquid nitrogen at nearly minus 200 degrees Celsius, the temperature where the chemistry of life essentially freezes in place. Those are long days in the lab. Thousands of tiny extractions to bank a meaningful amount of genetic material, and the people doing it are not chasing a curiosity. They are racing a crisis. Honeybee colonies have been collapsing across the world for 2 decades, hammered by disease, parasites, pesticides, and a shrinking pool of genetic diversity. A frozen archive of the species is a hedge against losing it entirely. Think about what that archive really means. If a disease tore through the remaining honeybee populations tomorrow, the diversity locked inside those tanks would be a way back. Bloodlines that no longer exist in any living hive could be thawed and rebuilt. It is a backup copy of a species, and we have never had one before. That alone would be a remarkable story. But a backup copy is also, by definition, a starting point. And this is not a fringe operation. The United States Department of Agriculture now banks honeybee genetics inside its National Animal Germplasm Program, the same kind of long-term vault used to preserve cattle and other livestock bloodlines for decades. Researchers have flown into countries across the ancient range of the honeybee, worked alongside local beekeepers, and carried frozen genetics back home, slowly assembling a library of an entire species written in cold. And here is the part that changes everything. That frozen material is not a museum exhibit. Scientists have already thawed it, used it to artificially inseminate living queens, and produced healthy, functioning colonies. They have done it across multiple generations, proving that a bee bloodline can be paused for years and then pulled back into the living world. The genetics survive the freeze. They wake up. They breed. So, when you hear the phrase millions of frozen bees, strip away the cinema and you are left with something genuinely real, a frozen vault of a species sitting in a steel tank capable of being revived on demand, which is exactly where the dangerous idea begins. The honest question.
Bee farmers across North America are sounding the alarm about a massive decline in bee populations. In the past 3 years, colonies have disappeared by an alarming 35%.
Here is where we step off the documented record and into a thought experiment. And I am going to be honest with you about that line, because almost every version of this story is not. No one has loaded millions of frozen bees into crates, driven them deep into the Sahara, and tipped them out onto the sand to see what happens. That single dramatic event, the one the title promises, did not occur. There was no secret convoy, no team watching in horror as the lids came off. What is real is not the stunt. It is the question buried underneath it, because the world genuinely is asking that question now. Pollinators are vanishing across enormous stretches of the planet, and they take entire food systems down with them when they go. At the same time, deserts are expanding. By some measurements, the Sahara has grown by more than 10% over the last century, creeping south into land that once fed people. Roughly 2 billion human beings already live in dry regions threatened by advancing desert. And the same warming that dries out those margins is also killing off the insects that keep whatever life remains stitched together. So, the people who actually do this work, the ecologists and restoration scientists with dirt under their fingernails, have begun asking something that sounds almost exactly like our title. If we can freeze a species and revive it, and if we can breed it deliberately for the traits we want, could we one day engineer pollinators tough enough to survive the very places that are turning to dust? Could a vault of frozen genetics become a weapon against the spread of a desert? That is the real version of millions of frozen bees released into the wasteland. Not a reckless stunt, a slow, deliberate, decades-long question that serious people are turning over right now. And to understand whether it could ever work, you first have to understand what truly happens when a bee meets killing cold and killing heat. Because the biology is far less forgiving than the fantasy. Quick thing before we go further. If you are the kind of person who clicks on a story like this because you need to know whether it could actually work, then this channel was built for you. Subscribe and stay with me, because the real science behind this idea turns out to be far stranger and far more useful than the myth that started it. What freezing really means. The myth wants you to picture millions of adult bees frozen solid, then thawed back into a buzzing cloud. The biology says no, and it says it firmly. An adult honeybee is not a seed or a single cell. It is a complex, water-filled animal, and water does violent things when it freezes inside living tissue. Ice crystals form, cell walls rupture. The damage is not something the bee simply shakes off in the sun. Now, bees are not helpless against cold. When temperatures fall, an adult bee slips into a state called chill coma, a kind of torpor where it goes completely still and its systems wind down. Within limits, it can recover from this, but the limits are narrow and they are merciless. Sustained cold somewhere between roughly -2 and -6 degrees Celsius is lethal to honeybees. Drive a cluster toward the bottom of that range and you approach near total death. Leave bees trapped in deep chill coma for too long, and most of them never rise again. So, the cinematic image, an army of solid frozen adult bees blinking awake on the sand, is not how any of this functions. What survives the deep freeze is not the bee. It is the blueprint, the genetics, the semen, the simpler biological material that can be vitrified and stored without being torn apart from the inside. That sounds like a technicality. It is anything but. It completely reshapes the thought experiment. You are not unleashing a frozen swarm. You are carrying a frozen design, thawing it inside a controlled lab, and growing the next generation from it. If the desert ever meets these bees at all, it does not meet the ones that were frozen. It meets their children and their grandchildren. And a desert has a very particular way of dealing with children. That is the reality the myth skips straight past. So, let us not skip it. Let us run the experiment the honest way and watch what the heat actually does. Opening the crates. So picture it properly. Suppose you ignored every warning, took living adult bees bred from thawed genetics, and released them straight into the open Sahara in the middle of the day. What would actually happen in those first minutes? The heat would answer before anything else did. Laboratory work has mapped the upper limits of bees with grim precision. Somewhere around 50 degrees Celsius, a bee reaches what scientists call its critical thermal maximum, the point where its muscles stop obeying it, and it can no longer coordinate its own body. A little hotter, and it tips into heat coma. And unlike cold torpor, bees almost never walk away from heat coma. The Sahara surface in full sun can climb well past that threshold, hot enough to cook an insect where it lands. A bee dropped onto open sand at the wrong hour is not in danger. It is already gone. The cameras, if there were any cameras, would catch them staggering, wings trembling, bodies tipping and struggling to find which way is up, under a sky that offers nothing back. For one long, terrible stretch, it would look like the desert had already won before the experiment even began. So, in the honest version of the scenario, the opening looks exactly like the brutal image the myth sells you. You tip out the crates. The sun does its work. Most of those first bees die fast, but not all of them. The ones that lived would be the ones that found the margins, the sliver of shade under a thorn tree, the cooler pocket of air inside a rock crevice, the narrow windows at dawn and dusk, when the sand has not yet become a furnace and has not yet given all of its heat back to the sky. This is not a guess. It is exactly how real desert-dwelling bees already survive, all over the arid world. They are not armored super insects. They are simply relentlessly good at refusing to be caught in the open when the heat peaks. Then there is water, the resource the desert guards most jealously of all. The myth imagines bees somehow conjuring it out of nothing. The reality is humbler and more clever. In arid places, the only reliable moisture often comes as dew, condensing on plant surfaces in the cold hour before sunrise, in droplets almost too small to see. Bees can and do gather water, and they use it inside the hive for cooling, but a colony with no flowers, no nectar, and no dependable dew is a colony on a countdown. No degree of breeding rewrites the simple arithmetic that a living thing needs to drink. And that single behavior, knowing when to hide, would be the only thing standing between an introduced colony and total erasure. Not a sudden mutation, not a miracle, just timing, shade, and luck. Which forces an uncomfortable question. If survival comes down to behavior the bees already have, then what exactly would freezing and breeding them actually add? To answer that, we have to look at the bees that already pull this off. The desert bees. Because here is something the fantasy never tells you. Bees already live in deserts, not honeybees from a vault, but wild native species that have spent untold generations being shaped by heat and drought, and they are quietly extraordinary. They forage in the cool edges of the day and shelter through the worst of it. Some can ride out long dry spells underground, waiting out conditions that would kill a softer species, emerging only when sparse rains bring a brief pulse of flowers. They have evolved bodies and behaviors tuned to extract every drop of value from a landscape that offers almost nothing. They do not fight the desert head-on. They fold themselves around it. Even honeybees are not powerless in the heat. A colony will cool itself by fanning thousands of wings in coordination, and by spreading thin films of water across the comb so that evaporation pulls the temperature down, the same principle that cools your skin when you sweat. Individual foragers can offload heat in flight and retreat the moment conditions turn dangerous. None of this is magic. It is ordinary, well-documented behavior. But it shows that the raw toolkit for surviving heat is already present in the species, which is exactly why breeding to sharpen it is not as far-fetched as it first sounds. And this is the crucial point, the thing that separates real science from the dramatic version. Those desert bees did not transform themselves in a single season. No individual bee woke up one morning with thicker armor or a brand new instinct. The adaptation happened the slow way, across countless generations, as the desert killed the ones that could not cope and spared the ones that could, and those survivors passed their advantages forward. That is evolution. It is patient, it is generational, and it cannot be rushed by dramatic music. So, when a story tells you that released bees grew darker wings within weeks, or evolved heat resistance over a single summer, or rewrote their own biology on camera, you are no longer watching science. You are watching wishful thinking, dressed up as discovery. An adult bee is born with the traits it has, and it dies with them. What changes is the population, slowly through its descendants. Understanding that gap between fantasy and reality is the entire key to whether this idea could ever work. Because once you accept that bees cannot transform overnight, you are left with a far slower plan. And that slower plan is exactly where the real possibility hides. What they cannot do. Let us put the fantasy fully to rest, because it matters. The dramatic version of this story has the bees building sprawling underground tunnel cities beneath the dunes, engineered colonies carving out a hidden civilization in the sand. It is a stunning image. It is also pure fiction. Honeybees are cavity nesters. In the wild, they shelter inside hollows, tree trunks, gaps in rock, and a desert-adapted colony would absolutely hunt for the coolest, most stable refuge it could find. But they are not ants, and they are not mole rats. They do not dig vast subterranean cities, and no amount of breeding turns them into something that does. The fantasy also loves precise, dramatic numbers. confirmed survival at extreme temperatures, seed production leaping by a quarter, new generations confirmed thriving in lethal heat, birds and mammals measured flooding back into a revived zone. Those specifics are what make the myth feel like a documented study. They are also exactly the parts that were never measured, because the experiment they supposedly come from never happened. So strip all of it away and ask what is honestly left on the table. Something quieter, and if you sit with it, something far more interesting than a swarm of mutant insects. It helps to be clear about the difference between an individual and a colony, because the myth blurs them on purpose. A single bee cannot adapt. It is locked into the body it hatched with. A colony, though, can shift its behavior dramatically inside a season. It can change when it forages, how it cools itself, how it rations stores through a lean stretch. That flexibility is real, and it is impressive, and it is also not evolution. It is a thermostat, not a transformation. Confusing the two is how a believable story quietly becomes a false one. What is left is a breeding program. You take the genetics of bees that already tolerate heat and drought, the lineages from the hottest, harshest corners of the species range. You freeze them in that vault. You combine them deliberately, generation after generation, selecting carefully for the traits that matter. And across years, not afternoons, you try to build a line of pollinator tough enough to work land that is currently too cruel for it. That is not science fiction. That is selective breeding with a freezer bolted on. The only real question is whether something that's slow could ever be aimed at something as vast as a desert and actually win. Where it could work. And here is what the myth gets right entirely by accident. People are already fighting to bring the edge of the Sahara back to life, just not with frozen bees. Since 2007, an African-led effort called the Great Green Wall has been working to hold back the desert along the Sahel, the semi-arid belt that stretches across the continent just below the Sahara. The ambition is staggering. Restore 100 million hectares of degraded land by 2030, across a band running roughly 8,000 kilometers from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. It is backed by the African Union, the United Nations, and a long line of governments and funders. And it has been genuinely grindingly hard. By 2020, the project had reached only a small fraction of its goal, slowed by funding shortfalls, conflict, and the sheer scale of the task. But it has not collapsed. Across the Sahel, somewhere around 20 million hectares have already been restored. In Niger, farmers practicing simple natural regeneration, protecting and nurturing the young trees that sprout on their own fields instead of clearing them, have brought green back to land that survey maps had already given up for dead. And that kind of regeneration works partly because life helps life. Trees shelter seedlings, roots hold water in place and slowly rebuild the soil. Insects carry pollen between the survivors so they can set seed and spread. Pull the pollinators out of that chain and recovery stalls, no matter how many saplings go into the ground, which is the quiet argument for why a bee program might one day matter at all. Now notice what is completely absent from that real success story. There are no frozen bee armies in it. The greening comes first, and it comes from trees, grasses, soil, water, and a great deal of human patience. And this is precisely where a pollinator program could one day fit. Not as the hero that single-handedly revives a dead desert. That part is fantasy, but as a piece that arrives once the land is finally ready for it. You cannot pollinate bare sand. There is nothing there to pollinate, but a fragile, recovering landscape full of young shrubs straining to set seed while the native pollinators that should serve them are long gone, is exactly the kind of place where a tough, deliberately bred beeline might tip slow recovery into something self-sustaining. That is the honest payoff hidden inside the title. Not millions of frozen bees conquering the Sahara in a season. A frozen genetic toolkit held in reserve, waiting for the moment a wounded ecosystem is finally ready to use it. And whether that moment ever arrives depends on questions nobody has answered yet. What remains unknown? Because meddling with an ecosystem is never as clean as a thought experiment makes it sound. Almost every time human beings have introduced a species to fix a problem, even with the best intentions in the world, they have risked turning the cure into the next catastrophe. A beeline bred to be tougher, more aggressive in its foraging, better at surviving heat, could outcompete and crush the very native pollinators that restoration is supposed to protect. It could carry diseases into populations with no defense. It could spread far beyond the strip of land it was ever meant to heal. Everyone serious about this work understands a hard truth. Excitement is not the same thing as caution, and the open questions stack up fast. Could a heat-tolerant line even be bred quickly enough to matter when the climate itself is shifting faster than bees can be selected? Would introduced colonies survive long enough, with no human help, to truly establish themselves? Would the genetics frozen in a tank today still match the deserts of 40 years from now? Or would the target move before the tool was ever ready? Nobody knows. These are not settled findings dressed up as a tidy story. They are the actual frontier, the exact place where the science runs out and the honest guessing begins. There is also the brutal problem of scale. A desert is not a garden. The Sahara alone is roughly the size of the United States, and the band of land along its edge that humans are actually trying to restore runs for thousands of kilometers. Breeding a hardy beeline in a lab is one thing. Producing enough colonies, placing them across a region that size, and keeping them alive without constant intervention is a challenge of a completely different order. The honest answer is that this would never be a single dramatic release. It would be thousands of small, careful local efforts, most of which would fail, a few of which might quietly take hold. And even then, success would not look like a green Sahara on a map. It would look like a single valley holding its seed crop one season longer than the year before. Small, local, unspectacular, the exact opposite of the swarm the title promises, and somehow far more hopeful than it. That is the version worth rooting for, even if it never once trends. Slow work rarely makes headlines, and this would be some of the slowest work there is. What we can say is narrow, but it is real. We can freeze a species and bring its genetics back to life. We can breed bees slowly for the traits we choose, and we are already fighting, with mixed and hard-won and very incomplete success, to push green back into the edges of the largest desert on Earth. Lay those three true things side by side, and the wild premise in the title stops sounding absurd. It starts sounding like a direction someone might genuinely take carefully across a lifetime, with every possible danger held in full view. So, what the Frozen Vault really offers is not a miracle. It is a glimpse. A quiet suggestion that the line between what is possible and what is not may be far less fixed than it appears, and that one of the tools for healing a dying landscape might already be sitting in a steel tank at -200 degrees, waiting only for us to be wise enough to use it well. The desert is not going to be conquered by a swarm. That was never real. But for the first time, something small and frozen and patient might one day become part of teaching it how to live again. So here is what I want to know from you. If we really can take a creature this small and teach a dead landscape to breathe again, should we be doing it everywhere the deserts are spreading? Or is that exactly the kind of meddling that comes back to bite us? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them. And if this story got under your skin the way it got under mine, subscribe and stick around, because the next one is just as impossible as this one.